Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. So the story is the most unbelievable pranks in medieval history. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The most unbelievable pranks in medieval history. Imagine yourself walking along a narrow cobbled street in a medieval town just as the first light of dawn begins to brighten the rooftops. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and freshly baked bread drifting from a nearby oven. Merchants are slowly opening their wooden shutters, while a few sleepy apprentices sweep yesterday's dust from the fronts of their masters' shops. Somewhere in the distance, church bells mark the beginning of another ordinary day. At least it appears to be ordinary. History often paints the Middle Ages as an age of endless wars, towering castles, deadly plagues, and stern-faced kings who never smiled. It is easy to imagine medieval people living lives with little room for laughter. Many modern films and stories encourage this image, filling every scene with mud, misery, and constant danger. Yet the real Middle Ages were far more human than we often imagine. People laughed, they joked, they teased their neighbors. Children invented games that have long since disappeared from memory. Students played tricks on one another. Traveling performers entertained crowded marketplaces with clever deceptions that fooled audiences only for a moment before everyone burst into laughter. Even monks, who lived under strict religious discipline, occasionally found themselves caught in surprisingly playful situations. The desire to laugh has always belonged to humanity. Long before the invention of television, cinema, radio, or the internet, humor traveled through spoken stories, festivals, practical jokes, and harmless deception. Medieval people understood that life could be difficult. Harvests sometimes failed. Winters could be harsh. Diseases appeared without warning. Roads were dangerous. Yet perhaps because life was uncertain, moments of laughter became even more precious. Tonight we are not following the footsteps of famous kings or mighty knights. Instead, we will quietly wander through villages, castles, monasteries, universities, and bustling medieval streets in search of something rather unexpected. The greatest pranks of the Middle Ages. Some of these stories sound almost impossible to believe. Others seem so familiar that you might recognize ideas still used by pranksters today. A few have grown larger with every retelling over hundreds of years, mixing history with folklore until separating fact from legend becomes almost impossible. As always, where historians disagree, we will gently explore the possibilities without pretending certainty where none exists. That is part of history's quiet beauty. The truth is often more interesting than the myth. As the morning continues, imagine leaving the busy market behind and walking toward the center of a prosperous medieval town. The streets become slightly wider. Stone buildings replace many wooden homes. Traders from distant regions unload cloth, spices, wine, salt, and curious objects that few local people have ever seen before. Among these merchants walks another familiar figure, the trickster. Not necessarily a criminal, not necessarily a fool, simply someone who understands people, someone who notices how easily the human mind can be surprised. Medieval storytellers loved clever characters who defeated stronger opponents not with violence but with wit. These figures appeared in countless tales told beside fireplaces during long winter evenings. Some were wandering servants, others were peasants. A few were court jesters whose official duty was to entertain nobles while gently mocking them. Humor often depended on expectations. If everyone expected a knight to behave with perfect dignity, seeing him covered in flour or accidentally sitting on a broken stool could reduce an entire hall to laughter. If everyone respected a proud scholar, watching him confidently explain something completely wrong could become the highlight of an evening. Much medieval comedy relied on ordinary human weakness: pride, greed, vanity, impatience, curiosity. These remain unchanged today. Although the clothing, buildings, and language have transformed across the centuries, human nature has remained surprisingly familiar. Imagine entering a village preparing for one of its annual festivals. These celebrations offered rare opportunities for entire communities to relax after months of demanding agricultural work. Music filled the air. Food became more plentiful than usual. Ale flowed freely. Colorful banners fluttered above market squares. For a short while, many of society's strict rules softened. Festivals encouraged playful behavior that would have seemed inappropriate during ordinary weeks. Masks appeared. Costumes transformed neighbors into imaginary characters. Children chased one another between stalls. Adults laughed more easily than usual. Temporary games invited strangers to participate together. Many practical jokes emerged from these celebrations. One common form of amusement involved harmless misunderstandings. A performer might loudly announce that an extraordinary creature had arrived from distant lands. Curious villagers gathered eagerly, expecting to witness some magnificent beast. After building excitement for several minutes, the performer dramatically revealed an ordinary goat wearing a decorated cloth. The crowd groaned, then laughed. The joke succeeded not because the goat was remarkable, but because everyone had willingly allowed curiosity to overcome common sense. This style of humor appears repeatedly throughout medieval records. Expectation, suspense, gentle disappointment, shared laughter. Rather than embarrassing a single individual, many jokes encouraged entire crowds to laugh together at themselves. As you continue wandering through this peaceful town, imagine hearing music drifting from a nearby square. Traveling entertainers have arrived. Among them are jugglers balancing wooden clubs, musicians playing simple instruments, storytellers performing heroic legends, and illusionists demonstrating tricks that seem impossible. Modern audiences often assume medieval people believed every illusion to be genuine magic. The reality was far more interesting. Many spectators fully understood they were watching skilled entertainment. Illusionists carefully protected their methods, using speed, distraction, hidden compartments, and clever timing. Coins appeared from nowhere. Small animals vanished beneath cups. Knives seemed to pass harmlessly through cloth. Objects disappeared into sleeves before anyone noticed. These performances inspired countless playful imitations among children, apprentices, and curious adults. Some succeeded. Most failed spectacularly. There are amusing descriptions of inexperienced young performers
accidentally revealing their hidden objects far too early, causing laughter for entirely different reasons than intended. Failure itself often became comedy. Perhaps one of the greatest misunderstandings about medieval humor involves the famous court jester. Popular imagination presents jesters as colorful figures endlessly performing foolish tricks before bored kings. Reality was much more complicated. The finest jesters were intelligent observers. They understood politics, they understood personalities. Most importantly, they understood timing. A careless joke could easily offend a powerful noble. A clever joke could relieve tension during difficult negotiations. Some jesters earned remarkable trust because they possessed a rare privilege. They could speak uncomfortable truths while disguising criticism as comedy. Imagine sitting quietly in a great hall after an enormous feast. Candles flicker against stone walls. Servants clear wooden plates. Musicians softly play in one corner. Conversation slows. The king appears thoughtful, perhaps worried, perhaps tired. Then the jester steps forward. Instead of directly criticizing anyone, he begins telling a humorous story about an imaginary donkey who believes himself wiser than every horse in the kingdom. Everyone smiles. The nobles understand. The king understands. No names are spoken, yet the message reaches exactly the intended listener. Humor becomes diplomacy. Pranks become lessons. Laughter becomes surprisingly powerful. Outside royal courts, medieval universities developed their own traditions of practical jokes. Students, despite living centuries before modern campuses, behaved in unexpectedly familiar ways. Historical records describe noisy celebrations, playful rivalries, elaborate tricks, and occasional complaints from local residents who wished the scholars would behave more responsibly. Young people have rarely changed. Imagine arriving in a university town after sunset. Narrow streets echo with conversation spoken in Latin, French, English, German, Italian, or countless regional dialects. Students crowd inexpensive inns. Arguments about philosophy suddenly transform into songs. Someone challenges another student to solve an impossible riddle. Another secretly replaces a friend's candle with one designed to extinguish almost immediately. The room falls dark. Confusion follows. Laughter fills the building. These harmless tricks remind us that even future scholars occasionally behaved like mischievous children. Monasteries might seem like the last places where humor could survive. Their daily routines followed careful schedules of prayer, study, work, and silence. Yet surviving manuscripts sometimes include tiny drawings hiding among serious religious texts. A solemn page discussing theology might unexpectedly feature a rabbit chasing a hunter, or a snail confronting an armed knight, or monkeys behaving like bishops. Modern historians continue debating exactly why medieval artists created these strange illustrations. Some may have contained symbolic meaning. Others may have reflected quiet humor. Perhaps after copying hundreds of serious pages, an exhausted scribe simply wished to make the next reader smile. Across the centuries, one small drawing quietly reminds us that even hardworking monks appreciated moments of gentle amusement. As afternoon sunlight warms the countryside beyond the town walls, picture yourself walking between green fields toward a small farming village. Life here moves more slowly. Families know one another well. Neighbors share tools. Children spend much of the day outdoors. Everyone notices anything unusual. This close familiarity created perfect conditions for harmless pranks. If someone borrowed a cart, friends might quietly decorate it with flowers before returning it. If a neighbor proudly purchased an unusually stubborn donkey, playful rumors might spread that the animal secretly understood human conversation. The owner would discover groups of curious children politely greeting the donkey every morning. No one truly believed the story. That was never the point. The pleasure came from watching curiosity spread from one person to another. Perhaps this reveals something surprisingly timeless. Many successful pranks depend less upon deception than upon imagination. People enjoy participating in shared stories. They willingly suspend disbelief for a few joyful moments. Long before social media spread rumors across continents within seconds, amusing tales traveled patiently from village to village, growing slightly larger with each retelling. A chicken became 10 chickens. 10 chickens became a mysterious flock. Eventually, someone insisted they had all laid golden eggs. Everyone listening recognized the exaggeration. Everyone laughed anyway. As evening slowly approaches, shadows lengthen across medieval roads. Travelers begin searching for places to rest before darkness fully arrives. Small inns become centers of conversation. Strangers exchange stories gathered from distant regions. Some tales concern battles. Others describe miracles. Many involve unbelievable tricks played upon unsuspecting companions. The finest storytellers rarely hurried. They understood that anticipation often mattered more than surprise itself. Listeners leaned closer. Firelight danced across wooden walls. The storyteller paused, smiled quietly, then delivered the unexpected ending. Exactly as people still do today. Perhaps this continuity explains why medieval humor continues to fascinate us. Technology has transformed nearly every aspect of daily life, yet laughter still follows familiar patterns. We enjoy clever misunderstandings, unexpected reversals, gentle embarrassment, creative imagination, shared amusement. The centuries between us and the medieval world suddenly feel much shorter. Instead of distant strangers trapped in an age of darkness, medieval people begin to resemble neighbors living in another time. They worried, they worked, they celebrated, they loved, and every so often, they played unforgettable pranks that remain part of local memory for generations. Some of those remarkable stories have survived, quietly waiting in old chronicles, forgotten letters, monastery records, and collections of medieval folklore. We will begin exploring some of the earliest recorded medieval pranks. Stories involving ambitious students, mischievous monks, wandering entertainers, and elaborate practical jokes that fooled entire communities, revealing how surprisingly playful the Middle Ages could truly be. The morning has fully arrived now, and the medieval town has settled into its familiar rhythm. Blacksmiths strike glowing iron with steady blows that echo through narrow streets. Bakers carry warm loaves from stone ovens, their rich aroma drifting into every corner of the marketplace. Farmers arrive with carts filled with vegetables, eggs, cheese, and bundles of herbs gathered before sunrise. The town feels alive, not with haste, but with the comfortable pace of people who have followed these routines for generations. As you quietly continue your walk, it becomes easier to notice something that many history books rarely mention. People are smiling. Not constantly, of course. Medieval life could be demanding, and every family carried its own burdens.
Yet laughter appears in small, ordinary moments. Friends exchange knowing glances across the market square. Children invent games using little more than sticks and smooth stones. Craftsmen tease apprentices who are still learning their trade. Humor was woven into daily life far more deeply than we often imagine. Many of the funniest stories from the Middle Ages survive not because someone intended to preserve jokes for future generations, but because monks, chroniclers, scholars, and local officials happened to write them down while recording something entirely different. Sometimes a prank appears only as a single sentence in a much longer document. Sometimes it is hidden inside the biography of a respected church leader. Occasionally it appears in the margin of a manuscript, added by a bored scribe whose sense of humor quietly survived alongside the serious business of copying sacred texts. These scattered glimpses allow us to reconstruct a surprisingly playful world. One of the oldest kinds of medieval prank, centered on mistaken identity. Long before photographs existed, and centuries before printed identification became common, appearance mattered greatly. Clothing announced status. Hairstyles suggested occupation. Colors carried meaning. A traveling merchant, a monk, a nobleman, and a farmer could often be recognized immediately simply by the clothes they wore. But what happened when someone deliberately dressed as somebody else? Disguise became one of the oldest forms of practical joking. During certain festivals, especially those held around the changing of the seasons, ordinary people temporarily exchanged social roles. Servants dressed like wealthy merchants. Young apprentices pretended to be respected masters. Villagers elected humorous mock kings whose authority lasted only until the celebration ended. Nobody truly believed that society had changed forever. That was never the purpose. The amusement came from briefly turning the familiar world upside down. Imagine entering a village hall decorated with evergreen branches during a winter celebration. At the far end of the room sits a man wearing an oversized wooden crown. Everyone bows dramatically as they approach him, pretending he rules an enormous kingdom, despite the fact that only yesterday he was repairing fences outside the village. He solemnly declares that every person entering the hall must sing before receiving supper. One by one, neighbors reluctantly obey. Some sing beautifully. Others cannot carry a tune at all. The entire room fills with warm laughter. By sunrise the next morning, the wooden crown disappears, and ordinary life quietly resumes. These playful reversals reminded people that power itself could sometimes become amusing when viewed from a different angle. Perhaps nowhere did clever humor flourish more unexpectedly than inside medieval monasteries. Modern imagination often pictures monasteries as places of complete silence where every hour passed in solemn prayer. The reality was naturally more varied. Monks worked together every day. They farmed, cooked, copied manuscripts, repaired buildings, welcomed travelers, studied theology, lived alongside one another for decades. Wherever human beings spend enough time together, humor eventually appears. Some surviving monastic writings gently complain about younger monks hiding sandals before morning prayers, leaving sleepy brothers searching the dormitory floor while everyone else struggled not to laugh. Other records describe harmless tricks involving benches moved only slightly out of place, candles exchanged, or harmless surprises hidden beneath folded robes. These jokes rarely interrupted religious life in any serious way.
Instead, they reveal communities filled with ordinary human personalities. One particularly charming tradition appears in medieval manuscript art. As scribes carefully copied page after page of important religious writings, they sometimes decorated the margins with extraordinary little creatures. Tiny dragons, playful monkeys, musical rabbits, cats chasing mice that suddenly turned around and chased the cats instead, snails confronting armored knights. To modernize, these illustrations appear delightfully absurd. Their exact meaning remains uncertain. Some almost certainly carried symbolic messages familiar to medieval readers. Others seem to exist simply because someone enjoyed drawing amusing pictures after hours of careful work. Imagine spending 6 months copying a single large manuscript by hand. Every letter must be perfect. Every page demands complete concentration. The room remains quiet, except for the scratching of quills. At some point, perhaps during a brief moment of tiredness, the temptation to draw a tiny rabbit playing a trumpet might have proved irresistible. Hundreds of years later, we smile at exactly the same drawing. Across the centuries, 2 strangers share the same quiet joke. Outside monastery walls, medieval schools developed their own traditions of playful mischief. Education was demanding. Students memorized enormous amounts of information. Lessons often took place in cold rooms during winter. Discipline could be strict. Naturally, students searched for opportunities to entertain themselves whenever possible. Some of the earliest university records mention disputes that sound surprisingly modern. Students hiding each other's books, secretly replacing lecture notes, creating elaborate nicknames for respected teachers, inventing humorous songs describing everyday academic life. One story from the 13th century tells of scholars who convinced newcomers that an imaginary local custom required every first-year student to greet a particular ancient tree before entering town. The new arrivals politely followed the instruction. Experienced students watched from a distance, trying very hard to appear completely serious. Only after several days did someone finally explain that no such tradition had ever existed. The newcomers laughed along with everyone else. Rather than causing humiliation, the prank welcomed them into the community. Shared laughter became a form of friendship. Traveling entertainers often carried similar humor from town to town. These performers possessed remarkable skill. A successful entertainer needed excellent memory, quick thinking, careful observation, and the ability to adapt instantly to changing audiences. If children gathered nearby, the performance shifted accordingly. If wealthy merchants filled the square, different jokes emerged. If local officials watched from the front row, performers carefully avoided causing offense. One favorite technique involved pretending that something astonishing was about to happen. The audience gathered. Expectation slowly grew. People leaned forward. Then the reveal proved wonderfully ordinary. Perhaps a beautifully decorated chest, supposedly containing an exotic beast, actually held a sleepy goose. Perhaps an impressive announcement about a mysterious foreign treasure ended with nothing more remarkable than a polished turnip. Everyone laughed because everyone recognized how willingly they had allowed curiosity to race ahead of reason. Human imagination had done most of the work. Children especially delighted in these performances. Many hurried home afterwards, attempting to recreate the same tricks for parents and neighbors, usually with mixed success. One child accidentally revealed the hidden object too early. Another forgot an important part of the story. A third laughed before reaching the ending. Even unsuccessful performances created new laughter. Mistakes often became funnier than the original joke. As afternoon sunlight spreads across the countryside, imagine following a quiet road leading between wheat fields, ready for harvest. Two travelers walk ahead, sharing stories to shorten the long journey. Roads during the Middle Ages could feel lonely. Conversation became valuable entertainment. Many humorous tales traveled this way. One traveler described a remarkably foolish innkeeper. Another claimed to have witnessed a goose clever enough to guard a vineyard. Someone else insisted they had met a village where every resident wore their shoes backwards. The listeners understood that these stories grew larger with each retelling. That was precisely the pleasure. Exaggeration transformed ordinary events into memorable adventures. Perhaps the greatest prank of all was convincing listeners to wonder, just for a moment, whether the impossible might actually be true. Markets provided another perfect setting for harmless deception. Picture a bustling square crowded with traders from many regions. Languages mix together. Coins change hands. Animals wander between stalls. Musicians compete with merchants, loudly praising their goods. Amid this cheerful confusion stands a salesman displaying a tightly covered basket. He announces that inside rests an astonishing creature never before seen in the kingdom. A small crowd gathers. Children squeeze between adults for a better view. The merchant describes feathers brighter than jewels, a voice sweeter than bird song, an intelligence beyond imagination. Finally, with great ceremony, he removes the cloth. Inside sits an entirely ordinary chicken. For a heartbeat, complete silence. Then laughter spreads through the crowd. Even the people who feel slightly foolish soon begin smiling. The merchant has not sold a miracle. He has sold a story. And for a few delightful minutes, everyone willingly became part of it. This playful manipulation of expectation appears again and again throughout medieval humor. The joke rarely depended on cruelty. Instead, it celebrated human curiosity itself. Curiosity made people gather. Curiosity made them listen. Curiosity made them hope. Without curiosity, no prank could truly succeed. As the afternoon slowly fades, shadows lengthen beneath the timber-framed houses of another village. Here, neighbors know every family by name. They notice immediately when anything unusual happens. One morning, someone wakes to discover every wooden bucket in the village neatly arranged around the central well. No bucket has been damaged. Nothing has been stolen. They have simply moved. Who carried them there during the night? No one admits responsibility. For weeks afterwards, villagers continue guessing. The mystery becomes more entertaining than any solution ever could. Perhaps young laborers organized it after an evening celebration. Perhaps traveling visitors decided to leave behind a memorable joke. Or perhaps the story grew larger. Each time it was retold until nobody remembered exactly what had happened. History sometimes leaves us these delightful uncertainties. Not every question receives a final answer. As evening approaches once more, warm light glows from the windows of an inn welcoming weary travelers. Inside, conversations rise and fall like gentle waves. Someone begins telling a familiar tale. Others interrupt, adding forgotten details. A listener insists the story happened differently.
Another claims it took place in an entirely different town. No one argues too seriously.
Accuracy matters, but enjoyment matters too. Stories belong to communities. Each generation reshapes them slightly. Some of the greatest medieval pranks survive today, not because every detail is historically certain, but because the laughter they inspired proved worth remembering. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath these old tales. The Middle Ages were not populated by strangers living lives completely unlike our own. They were ordinary people who found delight in surprising friends, welcoming newcomers with gentle tricks, laughing together after long days of work, and reminding one another that even in difficult times, joy could still be discovered in the most unexpected places. And as darkness settles gently across the medieval landscape, while the final conversations fade into the crackling warmth of the fire, another remarkable story waits just beyond the horizon. The first light of morning reaches the towers of a great medieval castle, long before it touches the villages below. High stone walls catch the sunrise, while the valleys remain wrapped in a cool blanket of mist. From the battlements, guards quietly watch the roads stretching towards distant forests. Inside the castle, servants are already awake. Fires are lit beneath enormous kitchens. Fresh water is carried from the well. Horses are brushed in the stables, and the first sounds of another busy day begin to echo through the ancient halls. It is easy to imagine such a place as serious beyond measure. After all, this is where rulers make decisions that affect thousands of lives. Ambassadors arrive bearing important news. Noble families discuss alliances and marriages. Military commanders study maps preparing for campaigns that may begin before the next full moon. Surely there is no room here for practical jokes. Yet history quietly suggests otherwise. Royal courts could be surprisingly lively places. Behind the formal ceremonies and elaborate etiquette lived hundreds of ordinary people. Cooks hurried through smoky kitchens. Tailors repaired expensive garments. Stable hands cared for valuable horses. Musicians practiced for evening feasts. Scribes copied endless documents, while servants carried messages through long corridors that seemed never to end. Where so many people lived together, humor naturally found its place. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the life of the court jester. Modern stories often reduce the jester to little more than a brightly dressed entertainer wearing a cap with jingling bells. While some certainly dressed in colorful clothing, the reality was often much richer. A successful jester was rarely foolish. In fact, many were among the sharpest observers in the entire court. Their profession depended on understanding people, a king's mood, a queen's patience, a nobleman's pride, a bishop's seriousness, the subtle rivalries that filled every royal household. The finest jesters recognized these invisible currents better than almost anyone else. Their jokes were carefully chosen, too gentle, and no one laughed, too bold, and they risked offending powerful individuals whose anger could have lasting consequences. It was a delicate balance, maintained not through recklessness, but through remarkable intelligence. Imagine entering the great hall during an evening banquet. Long wooden tables stretch beneath flickering candles. Silver cups catch the warm light. Roasted meat fills the air with rich aromas while musicians quietly play beneath carved beams darkened by centuries of smoke. Conversation flows comfortably until a brief silence settles over the room. The king appears distracted. Perhaps he has received troubling news from a distant border. Perhaps negotiations have proven difficult. Everyone notices. No one speaks. Then almost casually, the jester steps forward. Instead of addressing the king directly, he begins telling the story of an imaginary rooster convinced that the sun rises only because he crows each morning. The rooster becomes increasingly proud. He boasts to every animal on the farm. One day, curious neighbors quietly wake before dawn and watch. The rooster oversleeps. Yet the sun rises exactly as it always has. The hall falls silent for just a heartbeat. Then gentle laughter begins spreading from one table to another. Even the king smiles. No accusation has been made. No name has been mentioned. Yet everyone understands the lesson hidden inside the tale. Humility, wrapped carefully inside humor. These kinds of stories appear throughout medieval literature because they offered something surprisingly valuable. They allowed difficult truths to be spoken safely. Power can make honest conversation difficult. The greater a ruler's authority, the less willing others may become to offer criticism. A trusted jester could sometimes succeed where respected advisors remained silent. Not because the jester possessed magical freedom, but because laughter softened words that might otherwise sound harsh. Of course, not every joke succeeded. Some court records hint at awkward moments when humor failed entirely. A poorly judged remark, a misunderstanding, a joke delivered at precisely the wrong moment. These incidents remind us that comedy has always required careful timing. Even today, the funniest story can fall flat if told at the wrong occasion. Royal households also developed quieter traditions of playful competition among servants. Imagine two experienced cooks preparing an enormous feast. Each wishes to impress visiting nobles. Neither truly competes with hostility. Instead, friendly rivalry grows over the years. One secretly arranges vegetables into amusing shapes before they reach the kitchen. The other quietly hides a wooden spoon that always seems to disappear before important meals. After several days, the missing spoon mysteriously returns to exactly the place where everyone had already searched countless times. Nobody becomes angry. The familiar trick simply continues. Its repetition becomes part of the household itself. Many medieval castles functioned almost like small villages enclosed within stone walls. Hundreds of individuals worked together every day. Children grew up alongside. Experienced servants, young apprentices learned from aging craftsmen. People celebrated birthdays, weddings, harvest festivals, and religious holidays together. Naturally, friendships developed. And friendships often encourage harmless teasing. Among the younger pages serving noble families, playful challenges became especially popular. These boys, often beginning their training around 7 or 8 years old, learned manners, writing, reading, and eventually martial skills. Life demanded discipline, yet even discipline leaves room for youthful imagination. Historical accounts occasionally mention boys convincing newcomers that certain sections of the castle were haunted by unusually polite ghosts. The ghosts, they explained with perfectly serious expressions, disliked noisy footsteps, but greatly appreciated respectful greetings. New arrivals quietly whispered apologies while walking dark corridors after sunset. Older pages watched from hidden corners, struggling to remain silent until someone finally burst into laughter. No harm was intended. Soon the newcomers themselves joined in, welcoming the next generation. The tradition quietly continued, Elsewhere in the castle, scribes worked in peaceful chambers lined with parchment and ink. Their profession demanded extraordinary patience. Every letter mattered. Mistakes required careful correction. Days passed in concentrated silence, yet even here traces of gentle humor remain. Some medieval documents contain tiny illustrations hidden among decorative letters. A mouse pulling a cart, a cat reading a book, a fox delivering a sermon to geese. Perhaps these drawings held symbolic meanings, now partly forgotten. Perhaps they simply reflected the quiet imagination of artists, spending countless hours bent over wooden desks. Whatever their original purpose, they remind us once again that creativity often flourishes alongside routine, and not every medieval prank relied upon spoken words. Some depended entirely upon careful preparation. Imagine arriving at a noble banquet where every guest receives beautifully polished silver cups. Unknown to one particularly boastful knight, his cup has been replaced with one whose base is slightly uneven. Whenever he confidently sets it down, the cup gently tips sideways. Nothing spills, nothing breaks. Each attempt becomes slightly more awkward than the last. The surrounding guests politely avoid staring. Eventually, the knight notices everyone smiling. He examines the cup. Realization slowly arrives. Even he begins laughing. The trick succeeds precisely because it remains harmless. No reputation is destroyed. No property is damaged. Only pride receives a gentle reminder not to become too large. One reason medieval humor feels surprisingly modern is that it often targeted universal human habits. People boasting too much. People believing unlikely rumors. People pretending to know things they did not understand. People becoming overly confident. These themes appear again and again across centuries because human nature changes remarkably little. As afternoon sunlight fills the castle gardens, imagine noble children playing beneath carefully trimmed trees. Their toys differ from modern ones, yet their imagination feels instantly familiar. Wooden swords become legendary weapons. Simple sticks transform into royal scepters. Blankets draped across bushes become mighty castles. One child secretly hides another's favorite toy horse beneath a bench before solemnly announcing that it has accepted an important mission to represent the kingdom abroad. An anxious search begins. Minutes later, the horse returns with great ceremony, supposedly carrying invisible diplomatic messages from distant lands. The children cheer. Tomorrow, another game will replace it. The rhythm of childhood remains timeless. Outside the castle walls, traveling musicians arrive carrying stories collected across countless roads. Every court eagerly welcomed news from distant regions. Alongside reports of politics and trade came amusing tales. One performer describes a village convinced that a wandering goose possessed miraculous wisdom because it always stopped outside the same cottage. Eventually, someone realized the cottage belonged to the only family regularly feeding it. The miracle quietly disappeared. Another storyteller recounts a merchant who proudly claimed to own the cleverest donkey in Europe. According to the tale, the donkey understood 3 languages, recognized every road, and never forgot a face. Months later, listeners learned that the remarkably intelligent animal simply followed whichever traveler happened to carry the largest bag of oats. The audience laughed not because animals seemed foolish, rather because people so eagerly believed extraordinary explanations while overlooking ordinary ones. Such stories gently encouraged skepticism. Question impressive claims. Observe carefully. Remain curious. These lessons arrived wrapped inside laughter rather than stern lectures.
As the day gradually softens towards evening, candles begin replacing sunlight throughout the castle. Servants prepare sleeping chambers. Doors close against the cooling night air. Somewhere deep within the kitchens, workers finish cleaning enormous cooking pots after another demanding feast. Elsewhere, musicians quietly pack away their instruments. The great hall slowly empties. Only few conversations remain. Perhaps one elderly servant tells younger companions about a prank played decades earlier when he first arrived at court. The details have certainly grown with every retelling. Perhaps the missing pie became 3 missing pies. Perhaps one surprised noble became an entire delegation. No one minds. Stories naturally gather embellishments as years pass. The laughter they preserve matters more than absolute precision. Historians approach such tales carefully. Some rest upon firm documentary evidence. Others survive through oral tradition later written down. Rather than dismissing uncertain stories entirely, historians compare versions, examine contexts, and ask what these tales reveal about medieval society. Even when every detail cannot be confirmed, the humor itself often reflects genuine cultural values. People admired cleverness, kindness, quick thinking, humility. The best pranksters rarely relied upon cruelty. Instead, they encouraged everyone, including themselves, to recognize the amusing imperfections shared by all humanity. As darkness settles over the castle and the last candlelight flickers against ancient stone, the world grows peaceful once more. Beyond these walls, forests stretch beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Villages sleep, roads empty. Only the occasional owl calls across the fields. Tomorrow our journey will leave the royal court behind and follow wandering merchants, pilgrims, and traveling performers whose remarkable practical jokes crossed kingdoms, spread through marketplaces, and became some of the most unforgettable tales of medieval Europe. The sun rises gently over a winding road that disappears into the distant countryside. A light mist still rests above the fields, softening the outlines of scattered cottages and ancient oak trees. Dew clings to the grass, sparkling briefly before the growing warmth of the morning begins to lift it away. Somewhere nearby, a shepherd quietly guides a flock toward fresh pasture, while birds greet another peaceful day with songs that echo across the valleys. Unlike the great castles or busy monasteries we have already visited, these open roads belong to everyone. Merchants travel them with wagons full of cloth, salt, wine, and carefully packed pottery. Pilgrims walk for weeks, sometimes months, hoping to reach distant shrines. Messengers ride swiftly between towns, carrying sealed letters whose contents may influence entire kingdoms. Musicians, storytellers, healers, craftsmen, and wandering performers all share the same dusty paths. Along these roads, stories travel just as surely as people. A joke first told in northern France might slowly find its way into an English marketplace years later. A humorous tale from Italy could eventually be repeated in a German village, changing a little with every new storyteller who added his own imagination to the ending. In many ways, humor traveled faster than news. News belonged to rulers. Stories belonged to everyone. Imagine yourself walking beside one of these traveling groups. The pace is unhurried. Wheels creak softly beneath heavily loaded carts. Leather harnesses gently jingle as patient horses pull their weight over uneven ground. Conversation rises and falls naturally, helping to shorten the long journey. One traveler begins describing an unusual village where, according to his account, every rooster crowed only after hearing the church bell. Another traveler smiles knowingly. He has heard this story before. Only in his version, it was geese instead of roosters. Before long, everyone is laughing. No one argues about which version is correct. The changing details are part of the entertainment. This was how many medieval jokes lived. Not inside books, inside memory. Long before printing presses spread inexpensive books across Europe, nearly every story depended upon careful listening. A skilled storyteller became something remarkably valuable. He carried entire worlds inside his mind. Some performers could recite heroic poems lasting several evenings. Others specialized in amusing tales filled with clever servants, foolish merchants, boastful knights, or surprisingly intelligent animals. The finest knew exactly when to pause, exactly when to lower their voice, exactly when to smile before revealing an unexpected ending. Their audience supplied the rest. Imagination did the work that modern cinema accomplishes through images. As the travelers approach the first town of the day, the marketplace is already coming alive. Wooden stalls line the square, bright fabrics flutter gently in the morning breeze. Fresh vegetables create patches of green among baskets overflowing with apples, onions, herbs, and turnips. Fish sellers loudly announce the day's catch. Potters carefully arrange their delicate wares where sunlight catches the polished surfaces. Markets were not simply places to buy and sell. They were places to meet, to exchange news, to hear music, to discover unfamiliar goods, and quite often to enjoy a little harmless mischief. Among the crowd stands a traveling entertainer surrounded by curious children. He holds an ordinary clay cup upside down. Slowly he lifts it. Nothing. He places it back onto the table. After speaking for several moments, he lifts it again. A small pebble has appeared beneath it. The children stare in amazement. Where did it come from? Of course, the performer never reveals his secret. Instead, he continues. Now the pebble disappears. A walnut appears. Then an egg. Finally, to everyone's delight, a tiny mouse darts from beneath another cup and disappears into the crowd. Laughter follows immediately. The trick seems magical, yet most adults understand they are witnessing skill rather than sorcery. Good performers carefully protected this distinction. The church often viewed claims of supernatural power with deep suspicion, but clever entertainment built upon dexterity and illusion remained a familiar part of public festivals. The greatest performers understood something that remains true today. People enjoy being surprised, not frightened. Surprised. The best prank leaves its victim smiling a few moments later. Imagine an elderly merchant arranging expensive cloth outside his stall. Every morning he follows exactly the same routine. Every fold sits in precisely the same place. Every roll of fabric faces the same direction. One morning he discovers that someone has quietly rearranged every piece overnight. Nothing is missing. Nothing is damaged. Every color still remains. Only the order has changed. His neighbors watch carefully as he scratches his beard in quiet confusion. For several long moments, he wonders whether he himself made the mistake. Eventually he laughs, shakes his head, and begins arranging everything once again. Who was responsible? No one ever admits it. Perhaps that mystery
makes the story even more memorable. One of the most fascinating qualities of medieval humor is its remarkable gentleness. Certainly, cruel jokes existed just as they do in every age. History contains examples of mockery that caused genuine pain. Yet many of the stories preserved over centuries involve something quite different. They celebrate confusion rather than humiliation, wonder rather than embarrassment, shared laughter rather than ridicule. Perhaps communities remembered these stories because they strengthened friendships instead of damaging them. As the afternoon grows warmer, travelers gather beneath the shade of large trees beside the road. Bread is shared. Cheese is passed from hand to hand. Water skins slowly empty. Conversation naturally returns to stories. One young pilgrim mentions a curious tale he heard several villages away. Apparently, an innkeeper had convinced visitors that his cat understood Latin. Every evening, he claimed, the cat attended prayers with complete attention. Guests watched eagerly. At exactly the right moment, the innkeeper quietly dropped a small piece of dried fish beside the bench. The cat immediately walked toward it. The visitors gasped. "What remarkable discipline," one whispered. Only later did they realize that the animal had been responding not to sacred words but to familiar routine. The innkeeper had never actually claimed the cat spoke Latin. His guests had simply reached that conclusion themselves. Again, expectation created the joke. The medieval world was full of people who understood that imagination could sometimes be guided with only the smallest suggestion. Traveling musicians often joined these roadside gatherings. Many carried simple instruments that had accompanied them across hundreds of miles. After supper, music drifted into the cooling evening air. Songs celebrated love, adventure, harvests, friendship, and occasionally wonderfully ridiculous events that everyone knew had probably never happened. One favorite kind of humorous song described impossibly foolish characters. A fisherman searching for fish in a wheat field. A knight who feared butterflies more than dragons. A baker who accidentally baked his own hat into a loaf of bread. Listeners recognized the absurdity immediately. Absurdity itself became delightful. Children especially loved these impossible stories. Perhaps because children instinctively understand that imagination and reality can happily sit beside one another. Not every story must be true to contain truth. As the travelers continue onward, they eventually reach a busy crossroads where several roads meet. Here stands a roadside inn welcoming strangers from every direction. Such inns became remarkable centers of storytelling. Every guest carried experiences gathered elsewhere. Some had crossed mountain passes, others had sailed across narrow seas. Each arrival brought fresh tales. Naturally, some stories became larger every time they were repeated. A single unusually large fish soon became enormous enough to pull an entire boat. One unusually stubborn mule eventually transformed into an animal clever enough to unlock stable doors by itself. Nobody seemed especially concerned by these exaggerations. The growing impossibility became part of the fun. Among these wandering storytellers were individuals whose wit became famous far beyond their own villages. Although the precise details often blur beneath centuries of retelling, historians recognize recurring characters, appearing again and again across medieval Europe. The clever peasant, the quick-thinking servant, the wandering fool who secretly understands more than everyone else, the boastful, noble, outwitted by ordinary common sense. These characters allowed listeners from many different backgrounds to recognize familiar human behavior: pride, greed, vanity, impatience, curiosity. None belonged exclusively to kings or peasants. Everyone possessed them. Everyone could laugh at them. Perhaps that explains why these stories survived so successfully. They reflected humanity itself. As evening slowly approaches once more, imagine arriving at a large annual fair. Unlike ordinary market days, these gatherings attract visitors from remarkable distances. Colorful banners decorate temporary wooden stages. Jugglers perform beside musicians. Acrobats tumble across open spaces surrounded by cheering crowds. Animal handlers display trained dogs capable of astonishing tricks. Merchants offer spices whose fragrances seem almost magical to those smelling them for the first time. Everywhere, excitement gently fills the air. One performer loudly announces that he possesses a mirror unlike any other. According to him, the mirror reveals not a person's appearance, but their true character. The audience eagerly forms a line. One by one, people peer into the polished surface. Naturally, they see only themselves. Yet each steps away smiling thoughtfully. Some laugh. Others pretend to look unusually wise. The joke succeeds because everyone willingly participates. No secret mechanism exists, only imagination. Perhaps that was one of the greatest skills possessed by medieval entertainers. They invited audiences to become partners rather than spectators. Laughter belonged equally to performer and listener. The performance happened together. As twilight settles over the fair, lanterns begin glowing, one after another. Their warm light dances across smiling faces. Children grow sleepy against their parents' shoulders. Merchants quietly cover their goods for the night. Musicians play softer melodies as conversations become calmer. Travelers prepare to continue their journeys tomorrow, carrying fresh stories toward distant villages that have never heard them before. Some of those tales will remain almost unchanged. Others will slowly transform. A merchant becomes a king. A goose becomes a swan. A tiny misunderstanding becomes a legendary prank remembered for generations. That is the quiet magic of oral tradition. Stories remain alive because they continue changing. As darkness deepens above the peaceful countryside, countless roads stretch beneath the stars, connecting castles, villages, monasteries, and marketplaces into one vast web of shared experience. Along those roads traveled not only goods and pilgrims, but laughter itself. Gentle, creative, endlessly adaptable. The roads gradually disappear behind you as the countryside settles into the gentle silence of another early morning. Ahead, standing upon a low hill surrounded by fields and ancient trees, rises a medieval monastery. Its stone walls glow softly beneath the first light of dawn. Thin streams of smoke curl upward from the kitchens, while the faint ringing of a bell drifts across the cool air, inviting the brothers to begin another carefully ordered day. At first glance, this seems like the least likely place in medieval Europe to discover laughter. For centuries, monasteries have often been imagined as places of complete silence, where every moment was devoted to prayer, study, and quiet reflection. There is truth in that image. Life inside many monasteries followed a disciplined rhythm that changed little from one season to the next. The hours of the day were marked by prayer, Meals were simple. Work was steady. Books were copied with extraordinary care, sometimes taking months or even years to complete. Yet discipline has never erased humanity. The men who entered these walls did not stop being human simply because they became monks. They grew tired. They became curious. They formed lifelong friendships. They occasionally made mistakes. And perhaps surprisingly, they laughed. As you pass beneath the heavy wooden gate, the sounds of the outside world begin to fade. Instead of busy marketplaces and crowded roads, you hear quieter rhythms. The gentle splash of water from a stone fountain, the rustling of herbs growing in a carefully tended garden, footsteps crossing worn flagstones, polished smooth by generations of sandals. Everything seems peaceful. Everything seems ordered. Yet beneath this calm routine lived countless personalities. Some monks were naturally serious. Others possessed quick wit. A few became famous within their communities for gentle humor that brightened long days of careful work. Modern historians have gradually discovered these personalities hidden inside the very manuscripts the monks left behind. Imagine a young scribe seated beside a narrow window. Morning sunlight falls across his wooden desk. Before him lies a sheet of fine parchment, prepared from animal skin through hours of patient labor. Beside it rests small pots of ink made from oak galls, soot, and other natural ingredients. His feather quill has been carefully trimmed to produce elegant letters. For hours he writes. Every word demands concentration. A single mistake may require careful scraping of the parchment before writing again. The work is slow, deliberate, quiet. By midday, his shoulders ache. His fingers have become stiff. His eyes grow weary from endless lines of tiny letters. Now imagine that while decorating the margin beside an especially serious passage, he quietly draws a tiny rabbit, carrying a sword, far too large for its body. No one had instructed him to do so. No religious rule required it. Perhaps he simply smiled to himself before continuing with the next page. Centuries later, scholars would discover that very rabbit and wonder why it had appeared. The answer is not always clear. Some marginal drawings almost certainly carried symbolic meanings familiar to medieval readers. Others reflected political satire, moral lessons, or visual jokes that have become difficult to understand today, yet many seem wonderfully playful. Tiny monkeys imitate human behavior. Cats chase mice. Then unexpectedly, mice chase cats. Birds wear crowns. Fish climb trees. Snails challenge armored knights to combat. Few images have fascinated historians more than these curious battles between knights and snails. Again and again, across manuscripts copied in different monasteries and even different countries, tiny snails confront heavily armed warriors. Why? The honest answer is that no one knows with complete certainty. Several theories have been suggested. Some historians believe the snail represented cowardice, unexpectedly overcoming strength. Others think it symbolized resurrection because snails seemed to disappear during winter before returning with spring. Another possibility is much simpler. People enjoyed drawing absurd pictures. Sometimes humor survives precisely because it refuses to explain itself. Imagine turning the page of a magnificent religious manuscript, expecting another solemn illustration of saints or kings, only to discover a determined snail advancing toward a bewildered knight, carrying a shield nearly 10 times its size. Even after 700 years, the image still makes people pause. and often smile. The monastery library held countless treasures, but it also became a place where quiet friendships developed. Several monks might spend years copying books together. Without speaking during working hours, they gradually learned one another's habits. One brother always sharpened his quills before sunrise. Another quietly hummed while mixing fresh ink. A third had an unfortunate habit of misplacing his spectacles if he was fortunate enough to own such a precious aid.
Gentle teasing naturally followed. Some manuscripts preserve tiny notes written by exhausted scribes at the bottom of the page. One famously wrote that anyone reading the manuscript should pray for the copyist because his hand had become painfully tired.
Another joyfully announced that finishing the final page felt almost as wonderful as arriving safely in heaven. These brief remarks reveal ordinary emotions hidden beneath extraordinary craftsmanship.
They remind us that behind every beautiful manuscript sat a real person.
Not an anonymous machine, a human being. During long winters, when darkness arrived early and storms swept across the countryside, the monastery became an even smaller world. The brothers worked, read, cooked, repaired tools, cared for travelers seeking shelter, shared simple meals. Over time, familiar routines often invited harmless jokes. Imagine a novice carefully polishing brass candlesticks before evening prayers. Unknown to him, an older monk quietly exchanges one candle for another, slightly shorter than the rest. When all the candles are lit together, one burns out much earlier than expected.
The novice looks around in mild confusion. The older brothers continue reading as though nothing unusual has happened. Only later does someone quietly reveal the trick. The novice laughs with everyone else.
No embarrassment lingers. Instead, another small memory joins the shared life of the monastery. Food occasionally inspired playful moments as well. Medieval monastic meals were generally plain compared with the feasts enjoyed in royal courts. Bread, vegetables, cheese, fish, and simple soups appeared frequently. Meat was often restricted depending upon local rules and religious calendars. Precisely because meals were modest, small surprises became memorable. A loaf shaped in an unusual way, an apple carefully hidden beneath another serving bowl, a turnip carved into the smiling face of an imaginary saint. These tiny moments of amusement required little effort, but gently interrupted routine. Even the monastery gardens offered opportunities for quiet humor. Imagine an experienced gardener instructing a young novice to water a particular patch every morning. Several days pass before the novice discovers that nothing has been planted there at all. The older monk smiles kindly. The soil, he explains, needed the practice as much as you did. Whether such stories happened exactly as later generations remembered them is impossible to know. Yet they reflect something genuine. Teaching itself often included patience mixed with gentle playfulness. Medieval education rarely separated seriousness from storytelling. Lessons became easier to remember when accompanied by amusing examples. Animals frequently appeared in these stories. Foxes represented cunning. Donkeys suggested stubbornness. Lions symbolized courage. Crows became clever observers. The humor helped important lessons remain in memory long after formal instruction had ended. As afternoon sunlight fills the cloister garden, imagine two elderly monks walking slowly beneath covered archways. They have lived together for perhaps 40 years. They know each other's stories almost by heart. One begins recounting an incident from his youth involving an overly confident traveler who insisted he could never lose his way. Naturally, according to the story, the traveler spent an entire afternoon walking confidently in exactly the wrong direction. The tale grows slightly more elaborate with each retelling. Both monks know this, neither minds. The pleasure lies not only in the story itself, but in the familiarity of sharing it once again. Memory often becomes warmer than strict accuracy. Throughout medieval Europe, monasteries also welcomed countless visitors. Pilgrims, merchants, poor travelers, messengers, local farmers. Each arrival carried fresh news from the outside world. The brothers listened carefully. Sometimes they copied important information into chronicles. Sometimes they simply enjoyed an amusing tale before returning to their daily work. In this way, humor traveled even through places devoted primarily to study and prayer. Perhaps one of the greatest misconceptions about medieval monasteries is that they stood apart from ordinary society. In reality, they remained deeply connected to surrounding communities. They purchased supplies, managed farmland, provided medical care, educated children, offered hospitality, maintained libraries. Their gates opened far more often than modern imagination sometimes suggests. Consequently, the same jokes, stories, and playful traditions circulating through villages occasionally found new life inside monastery walls. Not every brother appreciated every joke. Some undoubtedly preferred complete seriousness. Others became remembered for unexpected wit. Communities, whether religious or secular, have always included many different personalities. That diversity itself created opportunities for humor. As evening approaches, the final prayers of the day draw near. Candles flicker beneath high stone ceilings. Voices rise together in ancient chants whose melodies have echoed through these halls for generations. The sound is calm, measured, peaceful. When the service ends, silence gently returns. One by one, the brothers leave the chapel. Some retire to their small sleeping chambers. Others finish remaining tasks by candlelight. A lone scribe carefully places a completed manuscript upon a shelf. Perhaps hidden somewhere inside its decorated margins waits another tiny rabbit, or another determined snail, or another smiling monkey whose quiet joke will remain unnoticed for hundreds of years before bringing unexpected delight to someone living in a completely different age. There is something deeply comforting about that thought. Across 7 or 8 centuries, laughter survives. Not because it was loud, not because it sought attention, but because someone, after a long day of careful work, quietly chose to leave behind a small reminder that even within lives devoted to discipline and faith, joy still had its place. And as night settles peacefully over the monastery, while the last candle slowly fades into darkness, our journey prepares to leave these quiet stone walls behind. The quiet stillness of the monastery gradually fades behind you as the road leads towards a very different world. Before long, the countryside gives way to crowded streets, lined with timber-framed houses, workshops, and busy taverns. Church towers rise above the rooftops, while narrow lanes twist between buildings that seem to lean towards one another as though sharing old secrets. This is a university town. The atmosphere feels noticeably different from the peaceful rhythm of the monastery. Here, conversation never seems to stop. Groups of students debate philosophy while crossing busy market squares. Young scholars carrying bundles of parchment hurry towards morning lectures, still trying to finish reading a text before the lesson begins. Professors, many already advanced in age, walk with calm confidence through streets they have known for decades. Latin fills the air almost as often as the local language. It is the shared language of learning, allowing students from England, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and many other regions to study together. Imagine hearing dozens of accents, all attempting to pronounce the same carefully memorized phrases. Some succeed effortlessly, others struggle. The result occasionally produces laughter long before anyone intends to tell a joke. Universities were remarkable places. They gathered ambitious young minds from across Europe into communities where curiosity, competition, and youthful energy mix together every single day. Wherever young people gather in large numbers, mischief rarely stays away for long. The Middle Ages were no exception. Although many imagine medieval students as endlessly serious figures dressed in dark robes, surviving records paint a far richer picture. They attended demanding lectures, they copied expensive books, they argued passionately about theology, law, medicine, and philosophy, but they also celebrated festivals, played games, sang songs, invented nicknames, and occasionally created elaborate practical jokes that became legendary among later generations of students. Picture yourself entering a lecture hall just after sunrise. The room is simple. Long wooden benches face a raised platform where the master will soon begin teaching. Wax candles still burn softly, despite the growing daylight filtering through narrow windows. Students gradually arrive, greeting friends before taking their places. One young scholar appears unusually confident. He announces that he has memorized every passage assigned for today's lesson. His companions exchange quiet smiles. Unknown to him, someone has carefully moved his notes during yesterday's study session. Not stolen. Simply placed inside another student's stack of manuscripts. When the lesson begins, the confident scholar reaches confidently into his satchel. Nothing. He searches again. Still nothing. A look of quiet confusion slowly replaces certainty. His friends wait patiently. After several moments, one of them quietly produces the missing pages with an innocent smile. The entire exchange lasts only a minute. Soon everyone, including the embarrassed student, begins laughing. Such jokes worked because they remained harmless. Nothing valuable disappeared. Nothing was damaged. Only confidence received a gentle reminder to remain modest. The rhythm of university life encouraged these small moments of amusement. Days often began before sunrise. Lectures demanded close attention. Books were precious and usually copied by hand, making study both expensive and time-consuming. Many students lived far from their families, sharing modest lodgings with friends from distant regions. These shared homes became lively centers of conversation once lectures had ended. Imagine 4 students gathered around a small wooden table illuminated by a single candle. Bread and cheese provide a simple evening meal. Open manuscripts lie scattered between them. One student struggles to understand a difficult philosophical argument. Another explains patiently. A third interrupts with a humorous comparison involving an exceptionally stubborn donkey. Within moments, serious discussion transforms into shared laughter. Learning itself becomes easier because humor softens frustration. Some traditions developed specifically to welcome new students. Modern universities often organize friendly events to introduce newcomers to campus life.
Medieval universities occasionally did something remarkably similar. Experienced students invented harmless customs, whose true purpose was less about embarrassment than about helping strangers become part of a new community.
One well-known tale describes newcomers being solemnly informed that every first-year scholar must greet an ancient stone near the city gate before attending their first lecture. The stone, they were told with perfectly serious expressions, had watched over generations of successful scholars and appreciated respectful greetings.
Several newcomers politely followed the advice. Older students observed discreetly from a distance. Only later did someone explain that the tradition had been invented years earlier and continued simply because each generation enjoyed passing it on.
The newcomers laughed. Within days, they too became part of the tradition. Next year, they would greet the next arrivals with equally serious faces. Thus, the story quietly survived, not through official university rules, through friendship. Books themselves sometimes became unexpected participants in student humor. Remember that during the Middle Ages, a single manuscript represented months of careful labor. Owning books was a privilege few could afford. Students borrowed texts constantly. Imagine one scholar spending several evenings searching anxiously for a commentary needed before an important lecture. Unknown to him, his roommate has carefully wrapped the manuscript inside an ordinary cloth used for storing bread. The book remains safely inside the room the entire time. Only its hiding place has changed. Eventually, the roommate opens the cloth while preparing supper. "There seems to be something unusual with today's loaf," he remarks calmly. The missing manuscript appears. Relief arrives first. Laughter follows immediately afterwards. The prank succeeds precisely because nothing precious has been harmed. Teachers themselves occasionally possessed quiet senses of humor. Although discipline remained important, many respected masters understood that students learned more effectively when curiosity remained alive. Some lecturers deliberately posed impossible questions at the beginning of class, allowing students to debate enthusiastically before revealing that the problem itself contained a hidden trick. Rather than feeling deceived, students often remembered these lessons for years. The surprise fixed the idea firmly in memory. Education has long recognized that unexpected moments capture attention. One elderly professor reportedly developed a reputation for beginning certain lectures by announcing that he had discovered an astonishing new argument capable of overturning centuries of accepted wisdom. The students leaned forward eagerly. The master paused dramatically. Then he proceeded to explain why the argument was completely wrong. His purpose had never been to shock. It was to teach careful thinking. By first awakening curiosity, he ensured every student listened closely to the explanation that followed. Humor and education quietly worked together. Outside lecture halls, university courtyards echoed with music during festivals. Students sang songs celebrating successful examinations, mocking difficult weather, praising generous innkeepers, and occasionally laughing about their own tendency to postpone studying until the final possible evening. Some habits, it seems, have remained unchanged for hundreds of years. Imagine walking across the courtyard on a mild spring afternoon. Cherry blossoms drift gently through the air.
Groups of students practice public speaking while others engage in lively debates. Nearby, someone secretly replaces a friend's ordinary walking stick with another almost identical, except for a slightly curved handle. Its owner notices only after carrying it halfway across the square. He pauses, examines it, looks back towards his smiling companions. No words are necessary. Everyone understands. The joke is complete. University towns also attracted travelers, merchants, and entertainers eager to meet educated audiences. Visiting storytellers often discovered that scholars enjoyed puzzles as much as stories. Simple riddles gradually became more elaborate. Questions contained hidden assumptions. Answers depended upon noticing tiny details overlooked by everyone else. The greatest satisfaction came not from defeating another person, but from sharing the moment when the solution finally became clear. Perhaps this explains why so many medieval student jokes involved clever observation rather than physical tricks, and knowledge itself became playful. Even examinations occasionally inspired humorous tales. One popular story tells of an anxious student convinced he had completely forgotten every lesson. He spent the evening before the examination wandering the town in despair. The next morning, still believing failure certain, he answered each question calmly because he no longer expected success. To his astonishment, he passed comfortably. Whether entirely true or gently embellished through generations of retelling hardly matters. The story reflects a timeless experience familiar to students everywhere. Sometimes fear proves far greater than reality. As the afternoon slowly turns towards evening, bells begin ringing across the university town. Lectures end, books close, workshops empty. Students gather outside taverns, exchanging stories collected throughout the day. Someone recounts the tale of the misplaced manuscript. Another remembers the mysterious greeting stone.
A professor quietly smiles while pretending not to overhear. These stories spread quickly. Within weeks, they become familiar throughout the town. Within years, they become traditions. Within centuries, they become history. Perhaps that is one of the most comforting discoveries we have made during our journey. The Middle Ages were not filled solely with kings, battles, and great cathedrals. They were also shaped by friendships, shared meals, patient teachers, curious students, quiet laughter echoing beneath ancient roofs. The small moments that rarely appear in official chronicles often reveal the people themselves more clearly than accounts of famous events ever could. As twilight settles over the university, warm light glows once more from countless windows where students continue reading late into the evening. Some struggle with difficult ideas. Some confidently prepare tomorrow's lessons. Others exchange one final joke before sleep. Outside, the streets grow peaceful beneath the stars. Tomorrow, our journey will leave the universities behind and follow medieval festivals, village celebrations, and seasonal holidays, where entire communities came together to create playful traditions, elaborate practical jokes, and unforgettable moments of shared laughter that brightened life across the Middle Ages. Morning arrives quietly over the countryside, and a gentle golden light slowly spreads across fields that have been carefully tended through the changing seasons. Thin ribbons of mist drift above small rivers before disappearing beneath the warmth of the rising sun. In the distance, the familiar sound of church bells echoes from village to village, carried softly by the cool morning air. Today feels different. Even before entering the village, you can sense an unusual excitement. Children are already running along the narrow lanes, laughing as they carry ribbons, flowers, and freshly cut branches gathered from nearby woods. Farmers who normally begin work before sunrise linger outside their homes, exchanging cheerful greetings instead of hurrying directly to the fields. The village blacksmith has left his forge unusually early. The miller's wheel still turns beside the stream, but even its steady rhythm seems somehow lighter today. A festival is about to begin. Throughout medieval Europe, festivals marked the passing of time more vividly than almost anything else. They celebrated harvests, honored saints, welcomed spring, remembered important religious occasions, and offered communities a rare opportunity to pause their ordinary routines.
Life in the Middle Ages demanded constant work. Fields required attention through every season. Animals needed feeding, regardless of weather. Tools broke. Roofs leaked. Firewood had to be gathered long before winter arrived. Yet when festival days finally came, villages seemed to breathe together. For a short while, everyday responsibilities stepped quietly into the background. Music replaced silence. Games replaced labor. Stories replaced routine. And laughter became almost as important as food itself. As you enter the village square, colorful banners flutter gently between timber-framed buildings. Long wooden tables have been arranged beneath the open sky. Fresh bread rests beside wheels of cheese, baskets of apples, smoked fish, and steaming pots prepared since before dawn. Neighbors greet one another warmly. People who spent much of the year working separately now gather side by side. Children weave through the growing crowd, inventing games whose rules seem to change every few minutes.
It is here that many of medieval Europe's most delightful pranks found their natural home. Festivals created a rare space where ordinary expectations could be gently turned upside down. Not through cruelty, not through chaos, but through playful imagination. One of the oldest traditions involved temporary reversals of everyday roles. Imagine a quiet village carpenter suddenly wearing a paper crown while everyone respectfully calls him Your Majesty. Nearby, the local baker pretends to act as the royal advisor, delivering wonderfully serious opinions about matters as important as whose goose looked happiest that morning. Nobody mistakes this playful theater for reality. Everyone understands the joke. For one joyful day, familiar roles become wonderfully flexible. The laughter comes not from mocking authority itself, but from recognizing how unusual life feels when ordinary expectations briefly disappear. These celebrations reminded communities that even the most serious responsibilities could occasionally be viewed with gentle humor. Perhaps the most famous example of this playful spirit was the medieval Feast of Fools. Modern readers often imagine it as complete disorder, but the reality was far more complex. Held in parts of medieval Europe, particularly during the later Middle Ages, the festival allowed lower-ranking members of certain church communities to participate in playful ceremonies that gently parodied everyday customs. The exact form varied greatly from place to place, and not every region celebrated it. Church leaders themselves often disagreed about the festival. Some tolerated it, others criticized it. Still others attempted to limit or forbid certain customs when celebrations became too excessive. This reminds us that medieval society was never perfectly uniform. Different towns, monasteries, and cathedrals often followed different traditions.
Imagine entering a cathedral town during one of these celebrations. Outside, ordinary life continues peacefully. Inside the community, however, familiar customs are being viewed through the gentle lens of humor. Ceremonial roles are temporarily exchanged. Songs contain playful verses. Smiles appear even among those who usually carry themselves with great formality.
The intention, at least in its gentler forms, is not disrespect. Rather, it offers a brief reminder that every human being, regardless of position, shares the same ordinary nature. Humility often hides comfortably beside laughter. Beyond religious festivals, village celebrations produced countless, smaller traditions whose details varied from one valley to the next. Many involved harmless puzzles. One family might quietly decorate another's doorway with flowers during the night.
The surprised household would wake to discover the unexpected gift without ever learning exactly who had left it there. Children delighted in guessing. Adults often claimed complete innocence while smiling just a little too knowingly. No reward was expected.
The mystery itself became part of the celebration. Imagine a group of young villagers carefully placing ribbons around the village well before sunrise. By morning, everyone notices the unexpected decoration. Who arranged it? Nobody says. The well has become more beautiful. The mystery remains unsolved. Both facts are equally satisfying. Elsewhere, friendly competitions often included playful tricks. Picture two neighboring villages preparing for an annual game of archery. The evening before the contest, someone quietly ties tiny bunches of wild flowers to every practice target belonging to the visiting team. When the archers arrive, they find their targets looking unexpectedly cheerful.
For a moment, complete confusion, then laughter. The flowers remain. The competition begins exactly as planned. No advantage has been gained, only smiles.
This gentle spirit appears again and again throughout accounts of medieval celebrations. The finest prank achieved something surprisingly simple. It encouraged everyone to laugh together. As the afternoon grows warmer,
musicians begin filling the square with lively melodies played on fiddles, pipes, drums, and simple stringed instruments. Dancers form wide circles. Young children attempt to imitate the older couples, occasionally stepping in entirely the wrong direction before collapsing into laughter. Nearby traveling performers prepare another entertainment. One announces that he possesses the most obedient goose in all Christendom. The audience gathers eagerly. The performer raises one finger dramatically.
The goose continues pecking calmly at the ground. He raises both hands. Still nothing. With exaggerated seriousness, he whispers mysterious instructions. The goose wanders away completely uninterested. The crowd bursts into laughter. The joke has never been about the goose. It has always been about the performer's wonderfully misplaced confidence. Medieval audiences appreciated this kind of self-deprecating humor. The entertainer willingly became part of the joke. His own dignity was offered freely in exchange for the audience's amusement. That generosity helped build trust between performer and crowd. Not every prank required careful planning. Many grew naturally from ordinary conversation. Imagine an elderly villager quietly telling several children that the oldest apple tree beside the church only produced its sweetest fruit after receiving a polite compliment. The children immediately surround the tree. One thanks it for growing such beautiful leaves. Another admires its strong branches. A third bows respectfully. Adults, watching from nearby, pretend complete seriousness. Only much later does someone explain that trees have never required compliments to bear the good apples. The children laugh. Next year, some of them will almost certainly tell the same story to younger brothers and sisters. Traditions often survive because they are enjoyable to repeat. As evening approaches, lanterns begin appearing throughout the village. Their warm light flickers gently beneath wooden porches and along winding paths. The festival slows into a quieter rhythm. Families gather around outdoor fires. Stories replace games. Older villagers begin remembering celebrations from decades earlier. One recalls a harvest festival when someone secretly exchanged every wooden spoon in the village hall with spoons carved from unusually twisted branches. The meal continued perfectly well, only every spoon felt slightly strange to hold. Guests spent much of the evening quietly comparing them before realizing the joke. Another remembers waking to discover every wheelbarrow in the village, carefully lined beside the churchyard gate. Nothing had been stolen, nothing damaged, only rearranged. No one ever discovered the prankster. Years later, people still smiled whenever the story returned. Perhaps that is what made these traditions endure. The prank itself lasted only a few moments. The memory lasted generations. As darkness gently settles across the countryside, the final songs become slower. Children grow sleepy against their parents' shoulders. The musicians play one last melody before carefully packing away their instruments. Neighbors say goodnight. The square gradually empties. By tomorrow morning, ordinary work will quietly begin again. Fields will need tending. Animals will require feeding. The blacksmith's hammer will once again echo through the village. Life returns to its familiar rhythm. Yet something has changed. Not the buildings, not the roads, not the fields. The people themselves carry fresh memories. Shared laughter has quietly strengthened the invisible bonds that hold communities together. Historians sometimes focus on wars, rulers, and great political events because those moments leave behind impressive records. But festivals remind us of another kind of history, the history of ordinary happiness, the history of neighbors who found reasons to smile together, the history of communities that understood how gentle humor could ease the weight of difficult lives. As the stars slowly appear above the peaceful village, another path begins to unfold before us. The morning sun rises slowly above the distant hills, casting long golden beams across roads that have carried countless travelers for centuries. The dew still glistens upon the grass, and a gentle breeze stirs the leaves of ancient oak trees that have watched generations pass beneath their branches. Somewhere beyond the next bend in the road, a horse quietly pulls a weathered wagon, its wooden wheels creaking with a rhythm as old as the road itself. Inside the wagon sits a man whose greatest possession cannot be packed into a chest. He carries stories, not maps, not weapons, not jewels, stories. With every village he visits, his collection grows a little larger. Some tales are true. Others have changed so often that even their oldest versions have long since disappeared. A few began as ordinary misunderstandings before slowly becoming legends repeated across kingdoms. The Middle Ages belong not only to kings and monks, but also to these wandering storytellers. They traveled from castle to village, from monastery to marketplace, carrying songs, poems, riddles, jokes. and curious tales that connected distant communities long before newspapers or printed books became common. Imagine joining one of these travelers for a single day. The journey begins quietly. The road stretches across rolling countryside where sheep graze peacefully beneath the watchful eyes of shepherds. Small streams cross the path, their clear water reflecting patches of blue sky drifting between slow-moving clouds. There is no hurry. The storyteller understands that arriving too early serves little purpose. Markets become liveliest as morning matures. By the time the first village comes into view, smoke already rises from dozens of chimneys, and the familiar sounds of daily life fill the air. Children are usually the first to notice a traveling performer. They gather almost immediately, not because they know what the visitor will perform, but because they know something unusual is about to happen. Adults continue working at first, pretending not to pay much attention. Yet before long, curiosity quietly draws them closer as well. A circle begins to form. The performer says nothing. He simply places an ordinary hat upon the ground. Then he waits. Silence itself becomes part of the performance. The crowd grows. Only when everyone is settled does he finally smile. "My friends," he begins softly, "I have traveled many miles carrying the cleverest bird in Europe." The audience immediately begins searching for a cage. None can be seen. The storyteller slowly opens a cloth bag with great care. Inside rests an entirely ordinary feather. He lifts it with exaggerated importance. "There," he says with complete seriousness, "is all that remains after the bird escaped." For a brief moment, nobody speaks. Then laughter spreads gently across the square. The joke depends entirely upon expectation. The audience created the magnificent bird within their own imagination. The performer merely allowed them to do so. This gentle style of humor appears throughout medieval folklore. Rather than mocking individuals, it celebrates the wonderfully creative ways our minds anticipate surprising endings. Perhaps no figure represents medieval wit more completely than the wandering fool. Modern language often treats the word fool as an insult. The medieval understanding could be remarkably different. Many fools deliberately appeared foolish while quietly observing everything around them. Their unusual behavior encouraged others to underestimate them. That became their greatest advantage. Throughout Europe, stories circulated about clever wanderers who defeated arrogant officials, boastful merchants, and self-important nobles, using nothing more than calm observation and patient humor. Some of these characters almost certainly never existed as historical individuals. Instead, they became symbolic heroes shared by countless communities. One village might call the trickster Martin, another preferred Hans. Elsewhere he became Pierre, Giovanni, or another familiar local name. The character changed, the lessons remained. Imagine such a traveler arriving at a prosperous market town. The local inn is crowded with merchants, discussing prices, weather, and roads. Among them sits one particularly wealthy trader who proudly announces that no one has ever managed to deceive him. The wandering fool listens quietly without interruption. Only after supper does he speak. "I believe you," he says warmly. "In fact, I have never met anyone so impossible to fool." The merchant smiles with satisfaction. The conversation moves elsewhere. Hours later, after everyone has retired for the night, another guest quietly remarks, "How fortunate you are." The merchant looks puzzled. Why fortunate? Because, the guest replies, the traveler achieved exactly what he intended. What did he intend? He persuaded you to spend the entire evening proving him correct. The merchant pauses, then laughs. No deception had occurred. Only perspective had quietly shifted. These stories remind listeners that pride often creates its own gentle traps. One of the most beloved legendary pranksters in medieval Europe was not famous for wealth or physical strength. He succeeded because he understood people. Across Germany and neighboring regions, stories of Till Eulenspiegel became especially popular toward the end of the medieval period. Whether there was a single historical person behind the tales remains uncertain, but the stories themselves reveal a great deal about medieval humor, rather than openly disobeying instructions. Till often followed them with perfect, literal precision. If someone gave careless directions, he obeyed every word exactly as spoken. The resulting confusion exposed unclear thinking rather than simple foolishness. Listeners laughed because they recognized something familiar. How often do people say one thing while expecting another? His adventures encouraged careful speech and careful listening. Without sounding like moral lessons, they quietly became exactly that. Elsewhere in Europe, similar characters appeared under different names. Some became village heroes. Others wandered endlessly from town to town. Many outwitted greedy landlords, others embarrassed dishonest officials. Almost always, intelligence defeated arrogance. These stories offered comfort to ordinary listeners whose daily lives rarely placed them above powerful people. Humor created a world where cleverness mattered more than social rank. As afternoon sunlight warms the marketplace, another performer begins preparing a different kind of entertainment. Instead of stories, he offers riddles. The first is simple. The second requires careful thought. The third seems impossible. The crowd debates enthusiastically. Children whisper suggestions. Older villagers confidently propose answers that immediately prove incorrect. Finally, the performer reveals the solution. The audience groans, then laughs. The answer had been obvious all along. They simply overlooked it. This style of playful thinking delighted medieval audiences because it rewarded observation rather than education. Anyone could solve the riddle. The only requirement was patience. Traveling musicians often accompanied these storytellers. Their songs mixed history with imagination so naturally that listeners sometimes struggled to separate one from the other. That uncertainty rarely troubled anyone. People understood that songs carried emotional truth even when details shifted through repeated performances. And one evening, imagine sitting beside a fire outside a village inn. Stars slowly brighten above the dark countryside. A musician begins singing about a remarkably boastful knight who claimed to fear absolutely nothing. According to the song, he confronted wild boars without hesitation, crossed dangerous rivers, faced fierce storms. Yet the moment a goose unexpectedly flapped its wings beside the road, the fearless knight jumped so high that he landed in a blackberry bush. The audience erupts into warm laughter. Everyone recognizes the gentle lesson. Even the bravest people possess unexpected fears, perhaps especially the bravest. As the song ends, someone begins telling another story. Then another. The evening passes almost unnoticed. One remarkable feature of medieval humor was its ability to travel enormous distances without ever being written down. A clever joke might begin in a French village before reaching England years later. Along the journey, details naturally changed. A fox became a wolf. A priest became a merchant. A miller became a baker. Each storyteller adjusted familiar tales for local audiences. This flexibility kept the stories alive. Printing would eventually preserve many versions. Until then, memory served as Europe's greatest library. Perhaps that explains why so many medieval prank stories remain difficult for historians to trace to a single origin. They belong to everyone. Communities shape them together. As evening deepens, the storyteller prepares to leave once again. The crowd gradually disperses. Children continue repeating favorite moments while walking home. Parents smile quietly, occasionally correcting details that have already begun changing. By tomorrow morning, the clever feather will become an invisible bird. The invisible bird may soon become a magnificent eagle. Before long, someone will insist they saw it with their own eyes. Thus, another legend quietly begins. There is something deeply reassuring about these wandering tales. They remind us that long before people could instantly communicate across continents, ideas still traveled. Slowly, patiently, carried not by machines but by voices, shared around fires, repeated beside market stalls, remembered during long walks between distant villages. Every storyteller added something of themselves. Every listener carried the tale onward. And somewhere, along those endless roads, humor became one of medieval Europe's most faithful traveling companions. As night settles gently over the countryside and the final embers glow beneath a sky filled with countless stars, another chapter quietly waits beyond the horizon. The night has grown wonderfully still. Above the quiet landscape, countless stars stretch from one horizon to the other, just as they did for every generation that lived through the Middle Ages. The roads we have traveled together now lie peaceful beneath the pale glow of the moon. The marketplaces have emptied. Castle gates have been closed until dawn. Monastery candles have burned low, and the last songs from the village festivals have slowly faded into silence. It feels like the right moment to pause. Our journey has carried us across medieval Europe, not in search of great battles or famous rulers, but in search of something much quieter: laughter. Along the way, we discovered something that history often hides beneath armor, stone walls, and dramatic legends. Medieval people were not so different from us. They worked incredibly hard. They worried about harvests. They feared illness. They hoped for peace. They loved their families. And whenever life allowed them even a brief opportunity, they laughed. Perhaps this is the greatest surprise of all. Many people imagine the Middle Ages as an age almost completely without joy. Popular stories often fill the centuries between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Renaissance with endless darkness, leaving little room for ordinary happiness. Reality was far more balanced. Life could certainly be difficult. Yet difficulty has never prevented humanity from finding reasons to smile. In fact, history often suggests the opposite. The harder life becomes, the more precious small moments of laughter appear. Throughout this journey, we have met wandering storytellers whose greatest treasure was not gold but imagination. We stood quietly inside monasteries where tired scribes occasionally left behind tiny drawings that continue to make people smile hundreds of years later. We visited universities where ambitious students discovered that friendship often grows through shared jokes just as much as through shared lessons. We wandered through lively festivals where ordinary villagers briefly transformed their familiar world into something wonderfully playful. Even royal courts, often remembered only for politics and power, revealed moments when careful humor softened tense conversations and reminded rulers that wisdom sometimes arrived wearing the simple clothing of laughter. One truth quietly connects all of these places. The finest medieval pranks were rarely cruel. Certainly, history contains examples of mockery, humiliation, and practical jokes that caused genuine harm. Every age has known such moments, and the Middle Ages were no exception. Yet those stories have not become the ones most lovingly remembered. Instead, the tales that survived across generations usually celebrate something gentler: curiosity, creativity, surprise, shared amusement. A prank that ended with everyone laughing together proved far more likely to remain in memory than one built upon embarrassment alone. Perhaps that tells us something important about the people themselves. Communities tend to preserve the stories that strengthen them, not those that divide them. As historians continue studying medieval manuscripts, legal records, letters, songs, and works of art, new details continue to emerge. Sometimes a tiny note scribbled into the margin of an old book reveals the personality of a monk who lived 7 centuries ago. Sometimes an overlooked village record preserves the memory of a local celebration that otherwise would have disappeared forever. Sometimes a humorous tale dismissed as simple folklore turns out to reflect real customs that once brought entire communities together. History is rarely complete. It continues growing. Every generation asks new questions. Every generation discovers fresh perspectives. The Middle Ages themselves have changed remarkably within our imagination. For hundreds of years, they were often described simply as the Dark Ages, a phrase suggesting ignorance, fear, and decline. Modern historians paint a much more careful picture. The period contained extraordinary diversity. Some regions flourished while others struggled. Universities expanded. Magnificent cathedrals rose above growing towns. Trade connected distant kingdoms. Scientific knowledge slowly developed. Art, music, literature, and craftsmanship continued evolving. And throughout it all, ordinary people continued telling jokes. It is easy to overlook laughter because it leaves behind fewer monuments than kings. No castle was built to commemorate a clever prank. No great cathedral preserves the memory of a mischievous student hiding his friend's manuscript. No royal crown honors the village child who convinced everyone that an old apple tree appreciated polite compliments. Yet these quiet moments mattered. Perhaps not to politics, but certainly to daily life. Imagine living through a particularly difficult winter. Food supplies grow smaller, the nights feel endless. Snow covers the familiar roads. Then one evening, someone tells an amusing story around the fire. Children begin laughing. Adults smile despite themselves. For a little while, worries become lighter. Nothing outside has changed. Yet something inside has. Hope has quietly returned. Humor possesses that remarkable ability. It cannot erase hardship, but it can make hardship easier to carry. That truth belongs to every century. As we look back across the 1,000 years that make up the medieval world, another lesson gradually appears. Many of history's greatest pranksters were not attempting to appear clever. Instead, they invited others to participate. A performer announced an impossible creature. The audience willingly imagined it. A storyteller described a wonderfully foolish night. Listeners recognized a little of themselves. A monk drew a rabbit carrying a sword. Centuries later, someone smiled upon discovering it. The joke continued long after its creator had disappeared. Perhaps that is one of the quiet miracles of history. Laughter survives. Empires rise. Empires fall. Languages change. Borders move. Buildings crumble. Yet a good story can cross hundreds of years with surprising ease. The people who first laughed at these tales never imagined that someone living centuries later would still find comfort in them. And yet, here we are, listening together beneath the same stars they once knew. The Middle Ages have often been remembered for their wars, for their castles, for their kings, for their plagues. All of those things certainly shaped history, but they were never the whole story. Between those famous events lived millions of ordinary people whose names have long been forgotten. The baker who secretly smiled while decorating a festival loaf. The apprentice who gently teased his closest friend. The traveling musician who transformed a crowded marketplace into a circle of laughter. The elderly monk who quietly drew one last playful creature before finishing a manuscript. The curious child who believed, if only for one delightful afternoon, that a goose might understand human conversation. These people rarely entered history books, yet they lived history every single day. Perhaps remembering them is just as important as remembering the rulers who commanded armies. History belongs not only to those who changed kingdoms, it also belongs to those who changed ordinary afternoons into cherished memories. As our journey finally comes to an end, the first hint of another dawn begins to touch the eastern horizon. The stars slowly fade. Birds awaken among the trees. Smoke rises once again from distant cottages. Another medieval morning quietly begins. The storyteller closes his book. The traveling performer continues along the road toward another village. The monastery bell rings gently through the cool air. Children wake, unaware that today's ordinary moments may someday become tomorrow's history. And somewhere, perhaps in a busy market square or beside a peaceful country lane, someone is already planning another harmless little prank that will leave neighbors smiling long after the surprise itself has passed. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson the Middle Ages offer us. History is not only made of crowns and battles, it is also made of shared laughter, of quiet kindness, of clever imagination, of ordinary people discovering joy in one another's company. And although centuries now separate our world from theirs, those simple moments remain wonderfully familiar. Thank you for taking this slow journey through one of the most unexpected corners of medieval history. May these forgotten stories remind us that behind every ancient stone wall, every faded manuscript, and every weathered castle lived people whose laughter sounded remarkably like our own. And perhaps somewhere tonight, beneath the same endless sky that watched over them all, that laughter still echoes very softly through history.